I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. I am Jesse Lawler, your host. Happy to welcome you to episode number 102 of this podcast, dedicated to the ongoing improvement of your own brain by any and all means at your disposal. This week we're going to be talking about a handful of related topics of interest to both brain and body owners: exercise, motivation, perception of effort. We're going to be speaking with Professor Sam Marora from the University of Kent, who has recently published a provocatively titled paper called "Can Doping Be a Good Thing? Using Psychoactive Drugs to Facilitate Physical Activity Behavior." So we're going to chew all around those topics in the main interview. If you hang around until the very end of the episode, in the Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick, we're going to get to the bottom of some recently published advice on how you might be able to spot a psychopath by what they're drinking, because it might not be as obvious as vials of human blood or something like that. That'll be at the end of the episode. But for now, let's kick things off, like always, with This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
So this is a really interesting story. We had an episode several months ago about the placebo effect. Placebo effect, I think we're probably all familiar with this, but quick recap. It is when people receive real benefits, subjectively speaking. This would typically be something like not feeling as much pain as one physiologically should, based not on a real medical intervention of any sort, but a sham intervention that the recipient thinks is real. Placebo can be very helpful, very useful, but also very difficult when we're trying to tease apart what interventions are actually doing anything. And a big part of drug testing is trying to figure out, does a drug being tested exceed the benefits that a group of patients receiving only a placebo treatment are going to feel? So thus the classic double-blind placebo-controlled study, which is the gold standard of medical testing nowadays. Anyway, so here's the weird thing. The placebo effect is getting stronger, but only in the United States, not the rest of the world. A research team at McGill University looked at 84 clinical drug trials starting in 1990 for medications that are prescribed to treat chronic pain. The study ended in 2013, so over that 23-year period, patients receiving placebos experienced a 30% decrease in pain levels on average, which is weird enough as it is, but what's even weirder is that there hasn't been any similar change outside the US in other places like Europe and Asia where they do similar trials over that same time period. The study's authors offer a few possible explanations for this strange finding, but of course nobody really knows. One possibility is that both the size and duration of clinical drug trials in the US has increased over the last couple of decades. These changes have happened in the US, but not so much in other countries. Over the course of that 23-year period, the average drug trial raised from about 50 people trying something for about 4 weeks to about 700 people trying it for about 12 weeks. And something that's already been established, I guess, but nobody knows why this is either, is that the longer a trial goes on, the more pronounced the placebo effect becomes. So it could be the change in the trial methodology has led to this apparent increase in placebo in the US during this time frame. Another option that the study authors put forward is that the US during that time period has seen an explosion in direct-consumer drug advertising. We've got drug commercials all over TV in the US, but we're the only country, aside from New Zealand, that allows drug companies to directly peddle their wares in this way. Again, nobody really knows what's behind this yet, but it sure is an interesting finding. And this study was first published in the journal Pain.
Smart Drug Smarts, where we turn information into sound, into bits, into packet data that turns back into bits and sound, and then into neurotransmitters that release funds that release mail-order synthetic chemicals that cross the blood-brain barrier to release augmented performance from your brain.
I went looking around this week on the international version of iTunes. JFrew44 in the UK said, "Love this podcast. Consistently interesting and informative. Jesse is a G." I'm not sure if I really am a G, but I appreciate what I assume is a compliment. DeBroy27 from Canada said, "Discovered this podcast a week ago and have not stopped listening. I've already learned so much about nootropics." And Pilkster from Australia said, "Stimulating, thought-provoking, and entertaining. Keep up the good work." So thank you so much to everybody who left those reviews. Also got a really cool piece of news this week. We were looking at our website stats, saw new traffic coming from some source. We hadn't known what it is. It was a site by Kevin Kelly, the founder of Wired. And it turns out that, lo and behold, unbeknownst to us, somebody, I guess, entered Smart Drug Smarts as a submission for one of the best podcasts of 2015. And we made the cut. We were listed in the top 50 factual podcasts of 2015, up there with some really, really solid and well-known podcasts. So in very good company. Was super excited about this. this. I don't know who it was that submitted us, but thank you to whoever you are. Thank you also to those of you who have been visiting Axon Labs over the course of the past week or two. AxonLabs.io is the retail wing of Smart Drug Smarts. We've got a couple of stacks over there, Nexus and Mitogen. We've seen a nice little uptick the last couple weeks. I think people are picking up some of those for stocking stuffers of the holidays. Definitely feel free to shoot me an email. Let me know your responses to either of those two products. And we do have that sale still going on now for the 2015 holiday season over at AxonLabs.io. Last but not least, would like to remind you, Smart Drug Smarts has a newsletter we're calling The Brain Breakfast, coming out, I think we'll be normally coming out on Sundays. Don't hold me to that, but it'll be Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, something like that. Kind of my little weekend writing project, but something that'll let you know about everything that we've got going on in the Smart Drug Smarts universe, and also a little spin around the web in the world of neuroscience, stuff that we're reading, stuff that we think is interesting. So check that out, get signed up at smartdrugsmarts.com/newsletter. But now let's move along to the main interview.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So Professor Samuel Marora, as you will hear from his bouncy Italian accent, is an Italian. He lives and works in the UK, though, at the University of Kent, and he's got a really interesting background. He picked up a bachelor's of physical education from the University of Milan and wound up getting a doctorate in clinical exercise physiology at the University of Wales, Bangor in the UK. Then about 10 years ago, he switched directions a little and decided to integrate his exercise and physiology background with motivation study in psychology and cognitive neuroscience. And he came to my attention, and probably a lot of people's attention, because of a provocative article that he published recently, proposing or at least opening the question of whether it might make sense to use psychoactive drugs to help people get over the mental hump that sometimes prevents them from exercising when they know that they really should exercise but just can't quite make themselves do it. There are some people for whom exercise comes really easily and they almost feel fidgety and uncomfortable when they're not doing it on a fairly regular basis, and then there are other people who are the complete opposite. And it's pretty much a given now that long-term low levels of physical activity are pretty bad for your body. So the question he raises is, for people that don't have the willpower to get themselves up off the couch, should we be looking for a chemical solution? So with that as preamble, let's jump in with Dr. Samuel Marora.
So my background in exercise physiology and psychology, in particular motivational psychology and cognitive neuroscience. I call it kind of like a psychobiological approach, I call it. Although my original motivation is to understand fatigue in patients, and actually still is, but I realized that there was very little understanding of the sensation of fatigue during exercise. We actually call it perception of effort or perceived exertion. The actual neurophysiology of it, even in healthy people, was very poorly understood. So I started to do a lot of studies in healthy people, and specifically also people that do kind of endurance athletes. The work I produced since then is very, very popular among triathletes, marathon runners, ultra endurance cyclists. Only very recently, with this editorial kind of switch into the general population, if you like.
I'm just reading a book right now that's dealing a lot with the genetic variability of human populations and how certain people are primed for certain sports. One of the weird rabbit holes that they go down in this book is sled dogs, and how the huge gains that they've made in sled dog racing in the past 40 years have been not trying to necessarily breed dogs for stronger muscles or even better endurance, but breed dogs that are more motivated to just run and run and run, and that the dogs live to run. They would rather be running than doing anything else. And that they can breed for that sort of mentality within the dogs, and ultimately that's what's winning races.
Yes, and also they've done it more recently, even in the lab with the rats. So they selected rats where they did two kind of selection. One that are kind of generally just physically active, and another selection was based on their kind of endurance performance. So you put a rat on a little treadmill and you make them run until they are completely exhausted, until they stop, which is actually a test that we do in humans as well. And of course, they found differences in the mitochondria, which is kind of the powerhouse inside any cell, but specifically in the active muscles. The heart is bigger, but also they did some studies on the brain and they found brain differences. In a way, all of my research on endurance performance, it's very much on the principle that the brain is actually the primary limiting factor, not as originally supposed, the muscle. Motivation per se is not a problem. The limiting factor is what we call, as I said, perception of effort. So when you do exercise, for example, if I put you on a bike at a fixed workload and you start to cycle, at the beginning, you will feel a certain level of effort. You feel that kind of moderately hard. But even if you keep the same workload, over time, this sensation of effort will progressively increase. And that's actually what limits performance, this progressive increase in perception of effort over time. So at a certain point, the effort that you perceive will be perceived as maximal, and therefore that continuing exercise is impossible. But in reality, there is actually a very recent study published this month, actually, or last month, in the Journal of Physiology, where they actually measured how much energy is left in the muscles when you finish a very intense exercise test. Because in the past, a lot of physiologists believe that you stop exercise when you run out of energy inside your muscles. People stop at VO2 max. They calculated that they could have continued cycling, in this case, at VO2 max for 8 minutes. And now we are talking about a highly motivated person, right? So motivation is not the limiting factor. And so people think, yeah, okay, so when people are highly motivated, they reach their physiological limit because they can push themselves to their physiological limit. The funny thing is, even if you're highly motivated, what still stops you is something that is psychological, but it's not motivation, it's the perception of effort. The theoretical framework in which I work is called motivation intensity theory. It's based on this principle of least effort. We exert effort, even a lot of effort, only if it's justified.
Is this essentially an adaptive behavior? Is this from back on the plains, back when we were not humans living in cities and every calorie was something that we had to strive for, and it was basically just about retaining all the calories we possibly could?
Absolutely. I mean, as you know, the thrifty gene hypothesis has been very prominent. There are a lot of critics about that because people think it's probably not famine that kind of drove the adaptation. It's probably the energy requirements of the brain. So in order to, because our brain is very metabolically demanding, in order to do that, we had to kind of save energies in other organs or with activity, or reduce activity when it's not necessary, or also, for example, in infection. So it's not so much that you die of starvation, but if you're very, very skinny, if you don't have much fat on you, if you get an infection, it's more likely you're going to die. So anyway, whatever the reason, whatever the evolutionary pressure, it seems that it's beneficial not to waste energy in an environment where energy is not so readily available, so that you can keep some energy stores when there's no food to fight an infection, to feed your brain, whatever. But it's useful to maintain some energy stores. And if you don't do that, you're less likely to survive. There's amazing studies in cows. They kind of look at the paths that they take when the grass is finished, to go somewhere else, to another pasture. And they calculated the energy expenditure of the path that they naturally choose. And given the options, they choose the one that consume less energy.
We've looked at this variation in the level of effort that people are willing to put out in physical tasks. Is there any correlation to the level of effort that people are willing to put out in mental tasks?
Not so much in this sense, but also I did an experimental study, which kind of was the very first that gave me a bit of fame in this area, also among the general public and among my colleagues as well. So I put people in front of a computer for 90 minutes doing a mentally demanding task. Obviously, that doesn't consume glycogen in your muscle. That doesn't tire your heart or your lungs or whatever. So from the neck down, you should be absolutely capable to do exactly the same performance that you do when you, instead of doing 90 minutes of hard mental work, you just watch some funny videos or something. Indeed, the control group was watching videos. In reality, we had a significant reduction in performance. And actually, the reduction in performance that we found was exactly the same reduction in performance that you see when you pre-fatigue the leg muscles. So fatiguing your brain is as negative on your endurance performance as fatiguing your muscles. As you know, if you go to the gym in the evening, like many people do, you know that sometimes, especially if you have really had a hard day at work, the exercise feels harder. And indeed, some people, they don't even go to the gym because they feel so knackered. They say, oh my God, if I go to the gym, it's going to be so hard. I just give up. I just watch telly and stay at home. And indeed, that's, I think, where, for example, the use of caffeine or other stimulants may be very effective in terms of the general population, because most of us train in the evening after work. So the mental fatigue kind of increases perception of effort even above normal. So it makes it even harder to stick to your fitness program. The problem with the general population is that they are not highly motivated. And you will think, why aren't they motivated to do exercise? Everybody knows exercise is good for you. There is tons of research. So knowledge is not an issue. They might not know exactly what they need to do, things like that. We need to work on that. But they know they need to be physically active. And they know that the reward is what is at stake, which is health, is an important thing. The problem is the delay of the reward. It's delayed maybe 10, 20, 30 years. And it's like on a risk basis. So, okay, you exercise every day now, and in 20 years' time, you are less likely to have an heart attack. That seems to be actually a very high reward because it's delayed in time and because it's probabilistic. It has very little motivating effects on people. So that's why I thought we need something a bit more drastic than just telling people that exercise is good for them. So this proposal of using psychoactive drugs kind of fall in that category, right?
So lay out your proposal for us, for the people that haven't read the article and are just coming across this podcast.
So basically, the idea is that we facilitate, we help, I call them lazy people. The assumption is that kind of everybody will have this tendency to be lazy. And unless you're highly motivated for whatever reason, you're going to avoid physical effort. That's an evolutionary kind of ingrained thing. So the idea is that we use psychoactive drugs to change the way you perceive exercise. Because obviously, we could tell you, just go out and do 2 minutes of a very light walk. The effort would be minimal, and maybe many people would do it, but that you don't get the benefits, right? Because you need to do it, even moderate intense exercise, you need to do it for half an hour, 5 times a week. So we cannot reduce the dose too much of exercise. But what we can do, we can change the way you perceive exercise so that the effort required to do the exercise that you need to do to improve your health is perceived to be lower. And the idea is that if we make the effort, the perceived effort required lower, there will be more people engaging with exercise on a regular basis. Specifically, the main issue here, which I think my proposal can help, is the issue of, we call it exercise adherence. Even when people get motivated enough to start a fitness program, we know from a lot of research, within 6 to 12 months, over 50% of the people that started drop out. It's a massive issue of maintenance. And I think using these psychoactive drugs to reduce perception of effort will help people stay on the exercise program in the initial few months. And then I think actually you won't need to take these drugs forever, because once the exercise, then it becomes an habit and you start to see the benefits of exercise after 6 to 12 months, then you may stick to it in a more natural way because then it becomes kind of self-rewarding.
How has the response to this proposal been?
Mixed.
I can imagine there's some pushback.
I mean, I've been a little bit deliberately provocative, but because actually in a way that's the purpose of an editorial. Even in some medical journals these days, some editorials which are kind of just to provoke, right? And the science behind it is a bit shaky, if not completely manipulated. I mean, I've been a bit provocative, but the idea was I think there is a lot of research to back up my proposal. Of course, we need to do more research to prove that this will actually work in practice, right? But in terms of theoretical basis and initial research, there is a lot of evidence that what I'm proposing is not actually as crazy as it may seem. I think the main problem is a cultural problem within my field of sports science or of sport in general, because in my field, when we talk about drugs that increase performance, we think about doping, and that's the perception of that is negative. And kind of I confronted the issue heads on by the title, can doping be a good thing? Can something that athletes use in a way that people perceive as cheating and therefore as banned, can the same thing, when applied to promote physical activity for health, can actually be a good thing?
Yeah, I think there's a giant difference when it's something which is not a competitive endeavor.
Exactly. Because one of the things is that together, obviously, with nutrition and other factors, physical activity is really mounting evidence that it has a very protective effect on the brain and on cognitive function in old age. And especially the kind of intense exercise that is actually intense enough to actually increase your fitness. It seems to be better than kind of the gentle walk kind of thing, which may be good to prevent things like heart attacks or diabetes, you know what I mean? But to actually get the maximum benefits in terms of kind of brain health, it seems that you actually need to do the kind of exercise that actually requires quite a lot of effort and it's quite uncomfortable. The runner's high. So this feeling good that you experience after exercise, especially after vigorous exercise, intense exercise, it may be uncomfortable while you're doing it, but after it, you feel energetic, you feel good. And imagine if you had a substance that could enhance that 10 times. In that case, you will increase the motivation of people to do exercise because they will have a higher immediate reward from it. In fact, it seems that people are addicted to exercise, or animals, they are addicted to exercise because they're addicted to this runner's high. They're addicted to the positive feelings of the experience after high intensity exercise.
What would your advice be to somebody that is essentially sedentary right now, that knows cognitively, that knows logically that they should be starting an exercise program, but hasn't been able to get off their duffs yet?
At this stage, I don't feel comfortable at providing direct suggestion to people because we need to do research, especially on the prescription drugs. For example, with caffeine, we know we have tons of evidence that caffeine reduces perception of effort, and there is less evidence, but still quite strong, that caffeine reduces what we call exercise-induced muscle pain. There are also studies, including some studies from ours, that increases what people call exercise enjoyment. The problem is that most of the studies are done in kind of fit people. There's not so much work done in sedentary people. We are working on that, and to be honest, the result seems to be very similar. What we don't know, what we really need to test, is whether this effect is maintained over a prolonged period of time and whether the effect is big enough to affect behavior. Intuitively, if you get something that reduces perception of effort and pain, you will say, okay, logically it's going to help somebody to stick to an exercise program. The question is it big enough to have a big effect on your exercise behavior? We don't know that yet. The closest we got in terms of research, we did a study in sedentary people, so it's relevant to the question you just asked. So we found, the usual reduction in perception of effort, pain, increase in enjoyment, blah, blah, blah. But also we added a behavioral measure, not just a self-report, a behavioral measure in terms of choice. So every 2 sessions, we had a placebo session, training session, and a session where they took caffeine between 30 and 60 minutes before the exercise in capsule forms, in a dose that is considered pharmacological but moderate, which is 3 milligrams of caffeine per kilo body weight. So for an average British man, that would be the equivalent of kind of 3 espressos. Anyway, so a moderate dose of caffeine, 30 to 60 minutes before exercise, and we found all the nice perceptual effects. Upon the top of that, we asked them, between these 2 sessions, which one do you prefer? And of course, this is placebo control. So they didn't know which session was the caffeine one. And 85% of people chose the one in which they took caffeine over the placebo one. It seems that the perceptual effects are strong enough to affect their behavior in terms of choice. What we haven't done yet, and what I'm seeking funding now for, is a long-term study where we follow up sedentary people starting exercise and follow them up for about a year. And one group will receive caffeine, the other group will receive placebo. And at the end of the year, we see which ones stuck to their prescription more. And obviously, the hypothesis is that the ones taking caffeine will be less dropouts, they will miss less training session. And as a result, at the end of the 12 months, they will be much fitter than the ones that didn't take caffeine.
That's one of those studies, it's worth doing, but it would be shocking if you don't find the expected result. It would be really baffling if that didn't wind up being true.
Yeah. We always have, it's full of nice hypotheses with strong rationale that then when you actually put them in practice in a complex environment, because behavior is complex and sometimes you need to test it. I'm confident, of course, I'm proposing this, but being a scientist, unless I see a nice large randomized control trial, I'm not happy to say that something is effective and that people should do it. But obviously, then in the long term, what really we need to do is to understand where this perception of effort comes from and develop drugs that are much more powerful in terms of reducing perception of effort than caffeine. Because actually, caffeine, it's very effective. Athletes take it. It's very common among athletes to use it. Indeed, it was in the doping list until 2004 because it is effective in improving performance. The reason why they took it off is because it's very difficult for them to distinguish between recreational use and use of caffeine as a doping agent. Because, to be honest, from an ethical point of view, I cannot see any difference between taking caffeine before a marathon, let's say, and taking modafinil. But modafinil is in the doping list. If you measure it on a scale that goes from 0 to 10, the reduction in perception of effort that you get by using caffeine is equivalent to 1 point on that scale. So it's significant. It's enough to change performance. It seems to be enough to change at least choice of training session, but it's not massive. If we had a new drug that instead of reducing of 1 point, it reduces 3-4 points on that scale. Can you imagine? Assuming that you are healthy and you can do that kind of, you could do high intensity exercise that is very beneficial in terms of health and fitness and even brain health. And importantly, it requires much less time than moderate intensity exercise because basically you need to spend half of the time exercising if you do high intensity, vigorous exercise than if you do just, brisk walking or something like that. But it would feel like walking or even less than that. Can you imagine?
Smart Drug Smarts.
So thank you so very much to Professor Marora for sharing his time with that interview. I gotta say, I'm a believer in this concept, although it's often said not without reason that we live in a culture which is too quick to look for take a pill solution for just about everything. And there's a lot to be said for diligence and work ethic and all those things. On the other hand, if that's not working for people, if they find themselves on the low end of the physical motivation curve and are just not able to, force themselves to get exercise, it seems to me that it's every bit as reasonable for somebody to take a supplement or a pharmaceutical that can help charge them up a little and get them over that hump versus having triple bypass surgery or getting a lap band or one of these much more extreme down the road solutions. One point that he makes in his article is that physical inactivity is responsible for twice as many deaths as obesity, and almost anything that's going to get people to do a certain amount of physical exercise weekly is probably a good trade on balance. Also, the book that I mentioned that I was reading in that interview and finished recently is called The Sports Gene. Really, really interesting book. Highly recommended for anybody that's interested in exercise physiology or genetics or even just some oddball stories of sports figures that you may not have heard of and some really, really amazing feats of physical performance. One point that book really hammers is that there's a very, very broad spectrum of physiological responses to exercise and types of exercise. Two people can do the exact same regimen of exercise. One person might have much stronger physical responses to it. It has nothing to do with how hard they're working, how motivated they are, what their diet is, any of those things. They might just have better genes for that particular exercise response. Another point that he makes, and I alluded to this with the snow dogs, he talked about it also with mice, and it's certainly true in people as well, is that there's this very, very wide bell-shaped curve as far as what feels like a comfortable amount of physical activity for a person to get. A lot of the people that wind up as professional athletes are out on the far end of the spectrum where they just default to exercising all the time. They actually kind of feel physically uncomfortable when they're not in motion, and so they build up these amazing physiologies and physical skill sets and become professional athletes. But for the people that happen to be on the other end of that bell-shaped curve where they just don't default to physical behavior, those are the kind of folks that Dr. Marora is trying to throw a lifeline to with his proposal in this recently published paper. But anyhow, let's move on to the ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts. Ruthless listener retention gimmick.
So a few years ago, I read a book called The Psychopath Test, which was a pretty interesting book, kind of a pop psychology book about psychopathy. And apparently about 1% of the population, more or less everywhere, I don't think this is particularly culturally dependent, are psychopaths. And psychopath isn't like being an albino where you either are or you aren't. It's kind of a spectrum thing, but all humans have some default level of empathy towards other humans. And once people start exhibiting a very, very, very vanishingly low level of empathy, that's kind of when they start entering that psychopath spectrum. And certainly not all psychopaths are dangerous, not all of them are violent, not all of them are criminals, but for that subset of psychopaths who do have violent tendencies or criminal tendencies, they have a lot less restraints on their behavior than, say, a vanilla variety violent criminal that still has more of an average level of human empathy. So anyway, we're all a little bit freaked out about psychopaths, for good reason or not. If we're living in a world of 7 billion people and 1% of the population is psychopaths, that means that there's 70 million psychopaths out there somewhere, and isn't that freaky? And wouldn't it be nice to know who they are? Just in case. So, published in May of this year, there was a study that cited that individual differences in bitter taste preferences are associated with antisocial personality traits. This was from the University of Innsbruck. We've got a link to that study on the website. It's a pretty long study, but one of the things that this says is that they confirmed the hypothesis that bitter taste preferences are positively associated with malevolent personality traits with the most robust relation to everyday sadism and psychopathy. Now, as one who's been known to drink black coffee on more than a few occasions, this puts me on the potential psychopath list. Black coffee is cited as one of the bitter-tasting foods that apparently correlate to these traits. Other foods that are listed are grapefruit juice, tea, and cottage cheese. And as a matter of fact, I had some cottage cheese today, too. However, there were some problems with the study. By the study's own admission, of the 10 bitter items on their food list, only half of them were actually perceived as predominantly bitter. The study was done on 953 individuals who self-responded to a series of questions about specific foods they liked, how much they liked sweet, sour, bitter, and salty foods, and finally they took a personality test, which among other factors looked for Machiavellian or psychopathic answers, whatever those are. Apparently Huffington Post took this story and ran with it, condensing this down to people that order black coffee are more likely to be psychopaths, which is probably a pretty salacious spin on the findings, but nevertheless interesting to banter about and a fun conversation starter next time you see someone ordering something bitter.
Just say no to scratch that. Say yes to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Join our mailing list at www.smartdrugsmarts.com.
Okay, that is the entire episode. Thank you for hanging around until the end of number 102. If you enjoyed what you heard, please tell a friend about Smart Drug Smarts. Word of mouth is a big help for us, and all those little shares and tweets and likes and newsletter signups make us want to do backflips. A lot of things make me want to do backflips. I would love to learn to do a backflip. The show notes for this episode will be online at smartdrugsmarts.com/102. Including the links to everything that we talked about here. I will be back at you next week, same time, same podcast, and as always with the same unflagging commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great week, and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only. Although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.